Hello and welcome to our webinar on sharing experiences in responsible safeguarding. I am Dr. Eleanor Wadinobi. I will be chairing the session today. Just a little about me. I am the Senior Advisor on the Nigeria Resource and Support Hub and wear another hat as the International President of the Medical Women's International Association. Issues around safeguarding are very close to my heart, as I belong to a coalition that is advocating for a global treaty to end violence against women and girls. And safeguarding is an integral part of that. Before we start the webinar, a few points on housekeeping. First of all, you have all been put on mute with your videos turned off. This is to support with the quality and connection of the webinar. Second, if you have any issues with tech or otherwise, you can write to us in the chat function and one of us will assist you. Please be aware that we will be recording this webinar to share on the online hub afterwards for anyone who was not able to join. Do be assured that your names will not be visible. Additionally, we are providing closed captioning in English for this webinar to support accessibility and comprehension of the content today. You can find this in your controls panel. Now that's at the bottom of your screen when you click more. You can view the subtitles as well as a live transcript. Please do let us know in the chat if you have any issues with this. The speakers in today's webinar are from companies who are members of the Safeguarding Leads Network, SLN. This voluntary network was established following the International Safeguarding Summit, which held in London in October of 2018 and includes 28 private sector companies delivering work on behalf of UK aid. Each organization is a signatory of the Putting People First commitments, committing to maintaining a working environment free of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and to protect from harm those that come into contact with their employees and program staff. Their purpose as a network is to seek out and share best practices in the prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment within the development sectors. Members have access to technical sessions, representation and collaboration across the sector to improve standards and the flow of information and engagement with various stakeholders. The SLN contributes to the various FCDO initiatives, including the Cross-Sector Safeguarding Steering Group, Soteria, Aid Worker Registration Consultations. Members have collectively identified 5 priority areas of focus for 2021, and these include leadership, diversity and inclusion, safeguarding capacity, reporting mechanisms, and survivor support. Today, you will hear about the experiences of 2 members of the SLN as their organizations have navigated the path to improving safeguarding measures to reduce SEAH. These organizations, Mott, MacDonald, and Justice Studio, were selected to offer examples of how 2 very different suppliers have gone about putting safeguarding measures in place. We are joined today by 2 speakers who I will introduce individually before their presentations. Now, we will end the webinar with a live Q&A session. However, if you would like to ask any questions during the two presentations, you can find the Q&A function in the controls panel at the bottom of your screen. You can add a new question or upvote any existing questions, and we will answer them at the end. The chat will also remain open, so please do add comments or share your experiences in there. And now for our first presentation. Allow me to introduce Jake Ross. Jake is a senior education advisor at Cambridge Education, part of the Mott MacDonald Group. He has lived and worked long-term in Bangladesh, Lao People's Democratic Republic, Zambia, and Nigeria on education research, capacity development, education system strengthening, and as country manager, with duty of care for up to 200 staff at a time. Jake is currently based in Cambridge, UK, where he leads on staff development for the international education team and on safeguarding within international development. Jake, we warmly welcome you.
Okay, thanks very much, Eleanor. If we could bring up the first slide, please. Thanks. So I've been invited to speak about our experience in shaping responsible safeguarding in our organisation, Mott MacDonald and Cambridge Education, as Eleanor's mentioned. Next slide, please. And we'll cover these 5 key points: how we've engaged with leadership in our organisation on the safeguarding agenda, what we've done in terms of, or learnt in terms of reporting mechanisms, survivor support, diversity and inclusion, and improving our capacity. Next slide, please. So to understand a little bit about Mott MacDonald itself, our purpose we describe as opening opportunities with connected thinking. And we apply that to improving society everywhere we work by considering social outcomes in everything we do. International development is just one sector that we work on, the others being infrastructure, transport, energy, water, the built environment, and others. And it's important to understand that international development is just around 5% of our total business. So as we're introducing the safeguarding agenda from the international development perspective, we have to ensure it lands with all those other sectors or those other professional colleagues. We're an organisation that's entirely owned by those of us who work for it. We don't have shares floated on the stock exchange. That gives us a certain independence of thought and helps us place our values at the heart of what we do across our nearly 16,000 staff in 100 countries. And for example, our intent to do the right thing was recognised in becoming certified as carbon neutral last year in our operations. Next slide, please. So when those of us in the safeguarding team have had the challenge of catching the attention of our executive board and our leadership teams around this agenda, one way to do that has been to share with them the real headlines for global brands, global corporations that you'll recognize on the screen. These are all genuine headlines. And just pause and think for a moment, how would it be if our own organization's name, and you might think about this for your own NGO or your own company, if your own name was headlined in the BBC News or in a social media coverage, how damaging that would be. Because none of us are immune from the potential of sexual or other forms of abuse, harassment and exploitation happening within our organizations. It can happen anywhere, either at our head offices in the global north or in countries in the global south equally. It's not something that's just happening out there, as it were. And an organization having a strong capacity in leading on policy and practice around safeguarding is not necessarily a defense against it failing to do the right thing internally. So we understand, and we're trying to foster the conversations with our leadership team around how abuses are rooted in power and privilege and how those operate, and that we have to go beyond safeguarding processes and compliance towards building a culture that reflects safeguarding in everything we do, not least in the COVID era when a whole new range of risks have come into view. And that there's a strong legal case for making sure that we're compliant on this. There's a strong business case, obviously, in terms of work we're allowed to do, a reputational case, and in terms of who we are in our sectors, and understanding the opportunities to do the work that we're committed to, but above all, a moral case to do no harm in the communities that we work with. Next slide, please. And so we've started to have the conversations with our leadership teams around how violence begins, possibly through inappropriate language, comments, jokes, insults, rumors passing around the workplace, and how those provide an enabling environment, a fertile ground for further escalation of other forms of violence, moving into physical, psychosocial, and sexual domains. Those things don't spring out of thin air, and it's our responsibility to ensure that microaggressions, the thin end of the wedge, do not go unchallenged and don't get perpetrated through our unwillingness to challenge taboos or speak about things we're embarrassed about, calling out bad behavior on the part of our colleagues, or applying the internal deference that we may have learned along the way in our cultures, to allow bullying or oppressive relationships to be fostered in the places where we work. So we need to find the right language, and we're on that journey for doing so, to talk about sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in our own business, with our supply chains, with the communities that we work with, just as robustly and as confidently as we do combating fraud or non-compliance with safety and security requirements. Next slide, please. And so to progress this strategically through a large, global organization with many different cultures represented within it, different professions, we've, and I would give credit to my colleague Khadija Fancy on this, we've developed a strategic framework that now has the endorsement of our executive board and our executive chair, all the leaders across Mott MacDonald, that's structured around the strategic shifts that the UK government identified as essential for us in the international development sector, but which equally apply for those other sectors in which we're working. So each pillar reflects prevention of harm, reporting cases where those arise, responding appropriately, and learning systematically from how we've handled cases. And each of those pillars we've organized with the same 4 building blocks to underpin what we're expecting to deliver in each of those pillars. So it's not enough to have a policy on a page. We have to develop the capacity for that to be how our work lives are practiced. We support the people within our business, especially those with the least voice, the least communications connectivity, the least power, to be heard equally, and to ensure that this infuses the culture right through our organization, our projects, our teams, and our offices. Next slide, please. So we were asked to reflect on how we've introduced reporting mechanisms throughout our work in international development and elsewhere. I think when we were considering how to respond on this, what we reflected was that the mechanisms themselves, the suggestions boxes that may be placed in schools like you see here, speak up hotlines, websites, line management pathways for communicating issues. These are not really the main point, the mechanism. The question is the culture and the trust that people place in how they can report. And if I give one example, we have an informal communications network called Yammer at our work. One female engineer who had had a bad experience on a site assignment, actually here in the UK, mentioned this in an informal network, and it was important that the group lead for safeguarding picked up on this, followed up with that colleague, and appropriate action was taken. So we wouldn't get too hung up on the mechanism itself. The question is whether people trust and use it. Next slide, please. We were also asked what progress we're making towards being survivor-led, and I think it would be inappropriate of me as a white British middle-class, middle-aged, cisgender male professional to try to speak to successes in this area. It's important that people like myself who have a certain degree of privilege and status are on board with and promote and drive this agenda, but I'm not going to try and speak on behalf of whether victims and survivors of safeguarding incidents have had a successful experience. What I would say is we have better and worse cases of how incidents have been handled, and we recognize that being survivor-led is something that takes a lot of time, and it may be something that where the survivor themselves decides they don't want to proceed a case or have their name attached to it at this time or possibly in future, and that in order to back up that individual, we may not be able to resolve the case in the way that our clients are expecting us to, possibly for legitimate reasons around fear of retribution on the part of the survivor themselves. Next slide, please. Our approach to safeguarding is located within our culture of working rigorously on safety within the workplace, and it aligns strongly to our equality, diversity and inclusion and people promise approaches, which are continually evolving and strengthening. And it's founded on raising awareness and understanding of how power and privilege operate in the workplace and how they can be abused between staff or between staff and partners in our supply chains or stakeholders in our communities or any combination of those. Next slide, please. So we aim to try to work with the grain of the organization. In Mott MacDonald, we have a lot of positive things already in place, as you can see on this image. But the thing about policies, this is not my own idea, but the thing about policies is they can tell you where you're going, but you still have to go there. And our challenge is to bring those things alive. Next slide, please. And so this year, our ambition is to conduct a red, amber, green assessment of where we are in terms of our strategic framework, and use that to engage with each part of the business around promoting and improving the safeguarding agenda at every level, in every location. Next slide, please. So I'll land on that point. There are a couple of links to resources here, and I'll be very keen to hear the next presentation and pick up in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jake, for these very useful insights. None of us, I'm sure, would want to populate that hall of shame. How true, beyond policy on a page to being infused in our culture. And indeed, it does make strong legal, business, reputational, and moral sense. Thank you once again, Jake. A reminder, please, that you can add your questions in the Q&A box, and we will answer them at the end. The chat is also open, so please do add your comments or share your experiences in there. And now, on to our second presentation. Allow me to introduce Marianne Moore. Marianne is founder, managing director, and chair of the Justice Studio. Marianne is an entrepreneur, strategy, and governance consultant specializing in social justice, with experience of working extensively in the UK and in over 30 countries in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Marianne envisaged an organization that would have all the good aspects of a corporate consultancy, yet was driven by empathy and compassion in everything it did. Her drive was to create a good business, somewhere that she and others would really love to work. Please join me to welcome warmly Marianne.
Hello, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's really nice to be here and to follow on from all of what Jake said, which I very much agree with. So that was great. So this is me. We can go to the next slide. That's okay. I've already been introduced. I'm the founder of Justice Studio, which is a compassionate consultancy. My background is in consultancy, and I really wanted to set up an organization that reflected the values that I thought were really important. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is 3 different things. So first of all, I'm going to just run through my organization, Justice Studio, and its core approach to what it does. I'm then going to talk about a specific project that we have, which is a safeguarding specific project, and talk a bit about that. And then from that project, some key reflections, which might be useful food for thought for those people who are on the governance board of your organization and thinking about safeguarding and really wanting to provide strong leadership around that. So we'll go to the next slide. Great. So first of all, I just want to talk about the overall safeguarding philosophy that we have and that I have, which is really thinking about what is the whole point of safeguarding. First of all, we have to acknowledge that we live in a hierarchical world. We live in a world where men have been more privileged than women, where wealthy countries and people have been privileged over other countries, where white people have been privileged over people of color, able-bodied and healthy people are privileged over others, and we live in a cis heterosexual framework, heteronormative framework, whereby other people are considered, other. So it's really about thinking, recognizing that we live in this hierarchical world where there are certain people that have power over other people, and thinking, what do we want to achieve? We want to achieve a situation whereby we have power with. So we're not trying to dominate anybody. We just want everybody to have a good amount of power and to be happy and to not have that structure. So that's the kind of overall aim and the philosophy behind a lot of what we do. If you go to the next slide, please. And then I set up Justice Studio almost 10 years ago now. So in May will be our 10th birthday, which is quite exciting. And I really wanted to create somewhere, as Eleanor said, that I wanted to work. And for me also, as a consultant who was particularly specialized in child protection, safeguarding, and criminal justice, I could see that the way that a leadership team is comprised and the way an organization is designed is absolutely key to how the rest of the team will feel and the kind of ethos that that company creates. So deliberately, I've set out to create a different kind of culture in our organization, one which fosters safeguarding practice from the very beginning. So we have a female leadership team mainly, we have a man on there, but we otherwise have a non-hierarchical structure, and we try and create a culture of trust and transparency and have equality as a key part. So we really think that you have to be really deliberate about this. You can't just kind of let something naturally flow. You have to be really thinking about all of these things at the very beginning of setting up an organization, and as you're leading an organization, to ensure that it doesn't slip into any default practices, because the default practices are quite hierarchical and can be harmful. Next slide, please. So we were really pleased in 2019 to win a project with the FCDO along with BDO, who are our partners. And our role was to look at safeguarding within aid, and BDO were looking at the fiduciary aspect. So we designed a unique methodology to look at safeguarding risks within aid. And in doing that, we wanted to capture everything. So in terms of a lot of the drive recently in safeguarding, it's been very much focused on sexual exploitation, which is great, but we try and think of it as inclusive as also a wider safeguarding remit. So we include the environment as well, and I'll show you a bit more about that. And the whole point of this program is that we help organizations to identify where there may be some safeguarding concerns, and then we build the capacity of that organization afterwards. So it's not meant to be a kind of going in there and criticizing or anything like that, or trying to find problems. It's about how can we be strategic about safeguarding rather than reactive, like not waiting for these headlines. We want to kind of stop that from happening in the first place. Next slide, please. So as we go into our program, what we've designed is we've designed these 15 safeguarding standards, and they cover different aspects of safeguarding that we look at in the organization. So that goes from governance down to the environment, as you can see. And some of the key methods that we use in order to address these standards is we will undertake interviews, we'll undertake interviews with the board, we'll undertake interviews with senior staff, with more junior staff, and do focus groups with different groups of people. We'll also talk to beneficiaries. We've gone out into the community and done focus groups to understand how does the project feel to the local community. Is it creating any kind of problems, or is it fine? Is it great? We also do an environmental assessment to make sure that the local environment of the program isn't being affected in a negative way too. We look at documents, we look at all processes and procedures to make sure that everything is sound from that perspective. But essentially what we're really trying to do is, as Jake mentioned, culture is key. And so we're trying to understand what's the culture like, because you can have the best kind of policy and procedures, but not necessarily have a very good culture. And so therefore safeguarding things could be happening without it looking like they would on paper. So that's what we really try and look at. And some of the challenges of that can be that in general, people don't like to report things. And certainly if an external organization is coming in to speak to them, they may be more unwilling to say something, especially if they're existing in a culture of fear already. So in terms of kind of trying to make sure that we are collecting all the information, it's hard to say if we can collect everything. But what we try and do, I think, is even by our presence and even by kind of going through this process, it starts people thinking about things that in a way that they might otherwise not. So we try and kind of let them think about the structure, about not just thinking it's something that happens at the bottom. Safeguarding is really something that needs to be led from the top. Next slide, please. And I think that's really the key messages that I wanted to get across today, and to just to give you some key findings or reflections, I would say, from the work that we've been doing with the organizations within this project. And I think firstly, it's just overall governance stuff. So thinking about safeguarding policy and procedures and culture, making sure there's knowledge of cases, that those cases are being reported, and thinking it's good if there's more cases being reported, because then you can deal with it. Looking at gender and racial pay gaps, and also monitoring and reporting channels, making sure you have safeguarding focal points and that they're fully trained and trained over and above your other people within the organization. And then also even having brilliant policies and procedures and all of these kind of processes, but making sure that they are communicated all the way downstream to your drivers, to your trainers, to all of the people that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise think as part of your train. And then the next slide, please. And I think the most important thing that we've come up against as we've been doing these reviews is there is a bit of a kind of resistance to thinking that it's the board that needs to change, or that the board needs to think about its diversity or its own training. And I think that a key point is that I don't believe any organization is going to be effective safeguarding wise unless the board is on board, if you see what I mean. If there's no commitment from up top, if there's no accountability up top, if there's no integrity, if there's the culture of trust is not set at that point, then it will be impossible for that to really be part of the organization, and for anybody to be able to feel free enough and safe enough to be able to report what they need to report. So I think making sure that the board is clear on the scope and has the safeguarding training and really role models good safeguarding behavior up the top in order to ensure that that trickles all the way down the organization. And the last slide. Yeah, so thank you very much. That's all, and it would be great to hear any questions.
Well, thank you so very much, Marianne, for your thought-provoking presentation. Indeed, that, we have to, pivot to a non-hierarchical world that fosters a culture and for us to be deliberate, about pivoting from power over to power with. How very important those two four-letter words are. And it's great to hear that, you have the wider safeguarding remit that includes the environment. But that's enough from me. We are now going to unmute the microphones of our guests and our attendees. And, please do raise your hand, and we will acknowledge you in order to put questions to our two presenters. I don't see any hands up yet, but, aha. Okay, I see one hand up, and I'll recognize Sarah McGuire. Sarah, you're unmuted. Please go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much, and thanks both for those presentations. I would be hard pressed to find anything that doesn't completely resonate with my own organisation, DAI, and many other organisations that we've had the pleasure of working with. And given that we're amongst friends, can I ask for either of your opinion on how you drive as an organisation, how you get to that grey area between there's a sort of we tend to think, sorry, I will rephrase that. We tend to think about reporting in terms of a sort of binary, you report or you don't report. There's an incident, there isn't an incident. There's an allegation, there isn't an allegation. But we know that with sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, as with many other forms of breaches, there's those areas where people don't know. And it's what we tend to call the it's probably nothing sphere. I'm not sure was that out of order? I don't really know. And how do you think you can build an organizational culture where it becomes normal to have those discussions, to have that sort of environment where people just talk about stuff on a free and sort of professionally curious basis?
Shall I go first? Is that all right, Maria? Yeah. Hi, Sarah. Nice to hear from you. I think that's a very good point, and this is something that we explicitly cover in the, we tend not to call it training, the initial engagements, the live webinar or face-to-face sessions back in the day that we run with every part of the business. We do say explicitly that if you're the first person who's told about something, you're likely not to feel sure about it, and you're also likely to feel very uncomfortable because of the taboos around sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And we need to find, we discuss in the session, we take a conversational approach around it. We need to find ways for people to recognize that they don't need to have all the answers at that time, that it's not their job to investigate the case, but what they do need to do is to present the right verbal and non-verbal behaviors, to listen compassionately, to indicate that the person is believed and taken seriously, and that they're right to have disclosed something, that we recognize that that's important, and that we as an organization are prepared to support them through the pathway that they may or may not themselves understand yet that they need to take around the incident or the pattern of behavior. And so for us, it's about giving people the reassurance that they don't need to know everything and deal with everything. And in fact, what's important is that they come to one of us in the safeguarding team or someone they trust within the organization to make sure the organization's on the side of or backing up the person who's feeling uncomfortable or ill-treated, rather than it to be the sort of environment where they're shut down or things are dealt with at the local level and never have the opportunity to percolate upwards, so that there's an institutional response that's systematic around this and using the power that we have in an organization for good and not for repression. Over.
Cool. I would echo what Jake said. I agree. I think it can be a bit damaging in this area to want to make everything quite black and white and to try and tip the grey into either a black or a white. It's either not okay or it's okay. And I think that we need to be careful that in obviously saying we have zero tolerance to abuses, we don't make the consequences so dire that it means that if you say anything that could potentially cause a lot of harm, that you wouldn't want to start that process, if you see what I mean, as a victim of something. So I think we need to be careful as a society as a whole as well, not just in organizations, about kind of what does that end look like, and is that preventing people from wanting to say anything at all. But also, I think the best way of starting to understand those grey areas and how it affects you as a person is through conversations in the group that you identify. So when you have like all female groups kind of starting to talk about shared experiences and thinking, actually, hey, that happened to me, that happened to me, that happened to me, and is that right? No, that didn't feel right. And kind of agreeing your shared boundaries, because sometimes it can be difficult. Any person is constantly negotiating their own boundaries as they live through their life. But to try and kind of get that camaraderie and understand, what are the boundaries that may have been crossed or not, I think is quite key. And having different places where different groups of people, different colors of people, different sexualities can kind of think about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, or at least somewhere where they can talk to other people who might have a shared experience, that they can do it in a way that's not necessarily going to go through loads of formal processes. So I think creating those kind of things, and also recognizing that it's always so grey. I think any safeguarding concern that ever comes up just always feels, you don't want it to be something really, you kind of want it not to be a problem, you kind of, it would be great if it wasn't a thing, but there's always so many nuances, and just kind of like living in that complexity and knowing all of the different things and trying to not necessarily have it a blanket thing, I think is also important. So knowing that sometimes there's going to be some uncertainty and some grey, and that's okay.
Thanks very much, both.
Okay, and please do note that we've got lots of questions about if we'll share. Yes, we will be sharing the slides and the recording of the webinar by email shortly after the webinar. I see a hand raised by Miss Jane, so if you don't mind, I'll take the live questions first and then go on to those in the Q&A. So do go ahead, Miss Jane.
Sorry, I think it didn't put my my first name there. Hi, it's Sanam Jane here from Crown Agents. Also sit on the Safeguarding Leads Network as well. Thank you both, really great presentations. And I think a lot of the conversation right now, it's really great to see what's happening at MacDonald and in a lot of our organisations, maybe at the HQ level, and at the even in the international office level, where we're trying to really address power, privilege, creating that culture where we can speak up. It's, you know, using platforms like Yammer, you know, is really, really great. Do you have any kind of practical or anecdotes about how you're doing that on the ground? Because I think it is easier to say we're putting in these policies or we're doing those trainings that that happen at the HQ level, and it's easy for the women to have their chats about, oh, this happened to me and that happened to me, but maybe that doesn't always translate in the field setting, and especially the settings where we might have many downstream partners. We all know how we have programs where we're in consortiums and in subcontracting, and then eventually having health facilities or schools where we're maybe a bit far removed. So maybe that kind of side would be really useful to kind of hear your thoughts on. Thank you.
Who would like to take that question?
Okay, so I can try and go first again if you don't mind. Yeah, it's a really important point, Sanam. There's definitely a real range of practice and capacity with our downstream partners, and we do recognise that typically, as the lead contractor, we have the ultimate duty of care for everyone within the supply chain and the communities we're serving in our project work. So the things that have been most effective have been implementing the kinds of approaches that Marianne has already spoken about, which is to engage with your stakeholders and identify gatekeepers or resource people embedded within our teams and within our suppliers' teams, as well as mainstreaming the approach and the expectations and the communications channels throughout all the stakeholder communities that we're touching on. So you need both the focal point person, and you need the mainstreaming of the messaging and the access to the communications channels. The variety of what people feel comfortable using as a reporting mechanism really depends on the technologies that people have access to and are comfortable with, how they're feeling about whether their identity is tied to the method of reporting that they're using. And it'll be really common that we come back to this point about people will talk to somebody that they trust, someone, a senior teacher in a school context, or a leader in a project team. That will often be the first point of contact, and it's picking up on those, recognizing how important those are, that really speaks to whether or not a partner is sensitive to this issue, picking it up and understanding their responsibility for dealing with it, and coming to us so that we can help with the appropriate management and information flows and follow-up. I think, well, I would probably pause at that point. Marianne?
Sure. Yeah, so we don't directly implement programs ourselves, but we look at what is happening, obviously, on the ground. And I think one of the key things that I don't know, I feel like we need to be mindful of as an organisation, and coming from where we are in, you know, a country that has kind of, well, I'm coming from England, and many of you are, but, you know, a country that's kind of colonised other countries, and is now kind of providing a lot of aid and technical assistance. There's been a kind of power structure that's gone on for a long time, and that power structure has been for a long time very domineering and also extractive. And the fact that we are now turning around and we're trying to be better and be like, okay, now we want to safeguard you and safeguard everybody is great. But I don't know if anybody necessarily trusts that. And also, we've already set up a system which is potentially quite, which is within the culture that we created a long time ago, right? These things take quite a long time to change. And I think we just need to be really mindful of who we are still, and our identity as, especially also big organizations trying to change smaller organizations or organizations further down the chain. What seems to happen a bit is that we push it down, which doesn't seem fair. And also, when you're with one hand funding an organization, or or kind of, being the conduit for funding to another organization, and on the other hand asking them whether they've done something wrong or to report things or something like that, I think it can feel like a not safe relationship. So people don't feel comfortable to be able to instigate this best practice that we want to instigate. So there's something about recognizing the historical legacy of where we are now, and being mindful of that, and recognizing the current power imbalance, and just really trying to build trust, because trust takes a long time. And I think there's a lot of mistrust, and rightly, which we need to kind of get through before anybody believes that what we're really trying to do is help.
Thank you so much, both of you. I'm going to sort of pull the questions that are directed at you specifically, Jake, and those directed at Marianne. So Jake, a couple of questions about some sort of core examples regarding the trust culture, and also regarding how there was one here about the RAG rating, and how often that'll be updated. And another question about, specific civil society organizations that are, good examples of CSOs successfully doing this on the ground and at project level. Please.
Right, thanks, Eleanor. Yeah, so the question of building a culture of trust, I mean, that's certainly not something you can just snap your fingers and do. The first steps have been about conducting what we call Safeguarding 101 conversations with all leaders and managers across the business. Trying to conduct those with relatively homogeneous communities, so that the kinds of risks that their staff and their stakeholders and communities face are kind of common within that team, and to explore what the reasons are that we're taking the approach that we do, and what their responsibilities and accountabilities are, firstly as individuals to do the right thing, set the right example through their behavior, but also how they flow that down through their parts of the business. Other times we're running those with entire teams from top to bottom to try to make the kind of language, the approach, the reactions, responses, communications, expectations, the business management systems, make those fully understood by everyone throughout that part of the business. And I think what we're looking for in those conversations is to pick up, on the one hand, I guess, where there's a certain degree of complacency that this isn't a problem here, or we've sorted this, we've had the Me Too movement and time's up and that kind of thing, so there's nothing to see here. It's usually that kind of inadvertent testimony that helps us understand that where we need to go further and explore the boundaries and assumptions people are using, and try to ensure that the right reactions and responses are the first thing that happens when cases arise. The other thing that's essential within the trust piece is that people see that when a case arises, that it's handled in the way that reinforces that sense of trust rather than undermines it. That's the shortest route to failing on this agenda. Sorry. Shall I move on just briefly? The RAG rating, we're piloting that in the international development teams this year, probably on a 6-monthly cycle, and then with the intention of rolling that out more widely through the business, because it aligns to how we manage risks and mitigate them. For examples of civil society organizations that are doing well on this, I wouldn't actually like to call out specific organizations, but there definitely are, through the self-audit processes that we conduct with all of our suppliers, it's relatively easy to identify those who are already grappling with these issues, and those for whom it's not on the agenda and we need to find another way of working or disengaging entirely.
Thank you, Jake. Marianne, if you can, in 3 minutes, address how you actually get boards to act. Zamora wanted to know about how you practically include the environment as part of safeguarding standards, and what you do when a survivor does not want the report made. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I just answer the quick one. If a survivor doesn't want the report made, if they're an adult, then you don't have to make it. If they're a child, then you do. And in terms of getting boards involved, I think basically you either scare them or you appeal to their better side, right? So you can either say at stake here is reputational damage, or you can educate them and start to help them to understand where they may have a blindness, because basically in the first instance, if they're not thinking that it's relevant to them, then they have a blindness about what might be going on in the organization and what influence they have, and then just really educate them about what does it mean. I think the Me Too movement has come up with also a lot of men that were saying, oh wow, I really didn't have a clue that was a problem, and they just had been blind to it. And I think it's that kind of thing, appealing to them to realize actually things could be going on in that organization and you have absolutely no idea, because nobody's going to tell you, because you're an all-white male board, and no one feels safe to tell you. You're kind of insulated from experience any of this stuff. So I would say, yeah, either appeal to their better or worst sides. And then in terms of environmental safeguarding, how do we, well, it is linked up with the community. So for example, particularly in these instances, access to cultural places is going to be partly community, partly the environment, access to kind of to food and water, making sure that the community's water supply hasn't been drained, or the things that they might otherwise access is still possible. Thinking about it in terms of the wider climate damage, the wider damage to forests, it is all interlinked with both community and environment and safeguarding as a whole, in lots of different ways, surprising ways. For me, who wasn't an environmental specialist and had to kind of learn a lot about it recently, it's intricately linked together. Well, I hope that was 2 minutes. I don't know.
You did extremely well. I mean, in view of the brevity of time. That's all we have time for today. And, you know, it's left for me to thank again our speakers for their informative and, you know, inspiring presentations. We hope that, you know, you, our attendees, are leaving this webinar with a better understanding of how suppliers, both large and small, established and new, niche, and those working beyond the development sector are putting in place responsible safeguarding measures to address SEAH, as well as some ideas that you can put into practice to assist in making your organization a safer place. Before we let you go, we will shortly be sharing a poll with you. Please do complete it, as it helps us to tailor our services to suit you better. For further information, there are many resources available to you. The poll is up. For an overview, we recommend the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub tip sheet on sexual exploitation, abuse, and sexual harassment in the private sector development programs. And for a comprehensive guide to all areas of implementing safeguarding, please do visit the Resource and Support Hub Safeguarding Journey page. There you will find curated resources for each step in the safeguarding process. You will also find a link to both these resources in the chat box. As we have promised already, you will be getting the presentations in your emails. Once again, thank you for joining us today.